But before that, let's look at the environmental, business and regional responses. And we begin with Tim Johnson, the Director of Aviation Environment Federation. It's a UK-based environmental non-governmental organisation which represents more than 100 organisations and their concerns over the environmental effects of civil aviation. He has been its director since 1997. He also chairs the advisory panel of the UK Aviation Industry Sustainable Aviation Initiative. And he is going to give us his response to the interim report. And again, each of these presentations, each of the next three presentations will be 12 minutes with 3 minutes of questions at the end. So bang your questions in quickly, but without further ado, please welcome Tim Johnson.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much and good morning. I think you've already been warmed up on the environment, judging by the questions in the last session. I think you've already started to get a feel for the strength of feeling amongst communities and NGOs about the importance of the environmental issues. And I think this is reflected, if you look at the Davis Commission reports, in how it sets out a challenge right at the outset, that this is about balancing the national interest with local considerations. And I think that's a key starting point, because while we've had a thorough review of the issues that make up the national picture, the demand versus the climate change pictures, many of the local impacts, the noise, the local air quality concerns in particular, have been looked at or will be looked at in detail in the second stage of this work. And therefore it's quite conceivable that each of the options that have been identified to date may yet face insurmountable environmental objections. And we have to be open-minded in that until we've looked through all the issues. Perhaps the starting point and the issue of foremost concern has to be aircraft noise. So far this morning has raised it. And I think everyone has been alive to a new approach about reconciling the differences that exist between airports and communities, about restoring trust, about looking at different ways. But what does it really mean? It's not simply about looking at the number of people affected by aircraft noise. The noise debate has become increasingly more complex. It's become more evidence-based, not just with people expressing increased sensitivity towards noise. And I think the facts do back up that over the last 2 decades, people are more sensitive to aircraft noise than they have been before. But new issues have come. There's much more health-based research. There's much more linkages between not just noise and annoyance, but noise and the health-related aspects and the impacts that has on people's lives. But there are new issues as well. There are people who expect not just high noise levels to be tackled, but they want tranquil areas to remain protected. So it's not about shifting noise from one area to another. I think there are other issues that we also need to look at. And that's, as people have already expressed, are best sort of summarized by looking at better and alternative metrics to improve the communication. And part of that has a role for a new regulatory authority. It's something that we have looked at. It's something that we feel is necessary, but it's only necessary if it actually tackles and reduces the noise problem. It's not there merely in an advisory role. The issue has to be governance. The reason why you have so much tension between airports and communities is that the successive governments have preferred problems to be resolved at a local level. And whilst powers exist through the CAA and through the Secretary of State, there's always a big sort of unknown quantity about when there is central government intervention, when people step in and actually start to regulate the noise. And that probably is a good role for an independent commission, to actually look at the balance between the airport interests and the community interests. And notwithstanding the work that the industry has done in trying to reduce noise, to step in and intervene when acceptable limits are likely to be breached and to regulate for that. I think we find it surprising that whilst we had, in the first phase of the Commission's work, consultations on climate change and on noise, we didn't have much mention or discussion of local air quality issues. This was the fundamental reason why a third runway at Heathrow was not progressed between 2003 and 2010, despite enjoying government support. The sticking point at the time was always how to reconcile the growth at the airport with meeting the legally binding EU limits on NO2. And as people have said this morning, the situation today hasn't changed. NO2 levels have gradually come down, but in many areas in and around the airport, they remain high. They remain either above the legal limit or marginally below it. There is no headroom at the moment to fit in a third runway and continue to comply with that limit. So, given the prominence of this debate, it seems to be a very understated issue and an understated challenge moving forward. And I think, we can look at the vast array of measures that were looked at, from improving aircraft fleet technology, but more importantly, perhaps the biggest challenge, fitting in new runways into areas where background air quality levels are already high. And with all the will of governments and with airport support, that means changing public behaviour. It means looking at assumptions made about the cars that you drive, how quickly they'll be turned over and will move to cleaner vehicles. Challenges that won't be easy to accommodate. And I think the last government appreciated that, which was why this was a difficult and perhaps insurmountable problem. And so I think that needs to be a real focus for the next stage of the Commission's work. I think we also have to look at wider issues that go beyond noise and air quality. Perhaps less obvious issues that you don't think about on a day-to-day basis. Unless you're familiar with an area, then you look at most of these options as maps. You see the cross for the church, you see the PH for the pub or the village shop. And they are just that, they're symbols. But largely, these actually represent, for a lot of villages that are actually in the firing line for new expansion proposals, the heart of their communities. And actually, it's difficult to put a number or a measure on these sort of people and community issues. The strength of feeling that people have when they've actually lived for generations in a village that's under threat. And these issues have to be taken into account. I think in particular in relation to the estuary options, we've already had comments about the wildlife impacts. And these too need to be significant. In many ways, they afforded better protection than some of the people are around the airports in regard to noise. But they are real challenges. Perhaps no environmental response to the interim report can be complete without mention of the climate challenge. I think in the interim report, the Commission highlighted the fact that the legislative framework for reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the 2008 Climate Change Act, which would require a cut of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. I think the Commission also recognised the advice of the Committee on Climate Change that aviation growth of around 60% is compatible with keeping aviation emissions at that 2005 threshold, around 37.5 million tonnes. Now, this may have been a target of the previous government, but it's difficult to see any other practical way of increasing this limit today. We're already requiring other sectors of the economy to reduce their emissions by 85% to accommodate aviation, even at that level. And creating additional headroom above that will be challenging. So whether it is a limit value or whether it is a sort of best practice target, it's difficult to see that there'll be much more available to the sector over that time. So that 60% growth, or the updated assessment that the Commission has made of 67%, dictate that aviation in the UK will be operating under a carbon constraint. Now, that growth may not preclude in itself another runway, but whether it's sensible to accommodate that, given that the existing capacity already exists in the UK system consistent with the growth under the climate change target, means that we will probably end up with a situation where we have vastly more airport capacity in the country than the climate change requirements permit. So the recipient of the Commission's report is going to have a difficult decision. Somewhere, capacity is going to have to be capped. And if we fit in another runway in the southeast, it's going to require capacity constraints elsewhere at the regional airports. There's also great uncertainty on many of the policy issues around aviation's continued inclusion in the emissions trading scheme, around the prospects of a global market-based measures, issues that my organisation and other NGOs desperately want to see, are working towards. But it doesn't mean that even with industry support for the same objectives, we're any closer to being able to grasp those. An uncertainty about the non-CO2 effects. I think the report makes a very understated comment when it says, when advice becomes available on the non-CO2 effects, should it require additional emission reductions beyond those planned, this would constitute a downside risk to the forecasts. So we're possibly gambling now on whether the overall 80% reduction can be met. We're gambling on whether the noise targets can be met. And I think this brings me to my final point, and it brings me to a point about process. A decision on a new runway relies heavily on forecasts and assumptions, especially in relation to environmental impacts and the supporting framework. There are lots of questions, but many of the answers will not be known until after a decision is taken. We put down the concrete now in the hope and expectation that mitigating measures will be forthcoming in a timely fashion. Communities, on the other hand, expect certainty, and they want guarantees. This is why our strong preference is to wait until there is more certainty on all the environmental effects before committing to other decisions on further increases in capacity. But without prejudice to this view, and one we continue to hold, it's worth considering how that certainty can be delivered. We need a review process, an opportunity to consider the extent to which future capacity can be utilised consistent with our environmental commitments. We started to get there under the previous government, where they started to instruct a system by which capacity increases would be made proportional to the environmental headroom that the industry was able to create. Now, in the context of a new runway, that may risk a new facility not being fully utilised. Maybe there's an investment risk to that. But it's right that this risk is shared, rather than leaving the burden solely on the communities and the environmental organisations to keep their fingers crossed that the environmental commitments, the legally binding targets and other objectives will be met. Thank you.
Seat. Question from front here. Microphone as quickly as possible, please. We've only got 3 minutes. Quick, quick, quick. Clive, just shout, but yeah, we need, yeah, okay.
I've lived under the runways for 40 years and represented people there for 25 years. Right, the third runway, one of the cases for it is that you can give people respite from constant noise. You didn't address that. Secondly, I have to say I'm disappointed that you haven't addressed the scientific and technological advances, both on fuel and noise. They are enormous. You do need to address it.
Thank you.
Well, I think on the second point, I mean, I think we welcome the technological advances. I think most of the assessments looking forward, both on noise and on climate change, will actually show you that the progress that's still to be made, let alone that that's been achieved already. But I think even the industry representatives in the room would not say that that provides you with the ultimate solution.
But you were saying you're looking for concrete evidence and so forth, but surely the next stage of the Commission should provide a lot of that for you.
I think it should provide the evidence.
So you don't need yet another, you don't need to wait any further.
Well, it should provide the evidence, but I think what my starting point for this debate was, because we haven't had that evidence yet, we have no certainty that any of the options on the table are actually capable of meeting the environmental challenge. And
the counter-argument would it be from you that both noise and air pollution is of such a level at Heathrow, you may as well just shut it anyway now?
Well, we had a previous government who welcomed a third runway at Heathrow that was not able to move forward with the plans because of the air quality constraints at Heathrow. Yes. It was a legal limit. You know, the industry had 7 years to come up with the responses, and during that time, it was not able to convince government they could do so.
Gentleman, right in the middle, there's a microphone. Yes.
Darren Kaplan, Airport Operators Association. We're a national trade association for airports. I want to challenge this notion that aviation can't grow in the UK because of carbon and noise. Now, Sustainable Aviation, which is a coalition of airports, airlines, aircraft and engine manufacturers, air traffic service providers, have done some work on this. Did a carbon roadmap in 2012, a noise roadmap last year. Both clearly show that aviation can grow by 90% in terms of air traffic movements without increasing carbon and noise. So surely that means our sector can grow and deal with carbon and noise at the same time.
There was nothing in my presentation that disputed the fact that there was still 60% of the Commission's revised figure in the system.
It's not in the South East.
Well, the point we were making is you've already have runway capacity in the UK capable of satisfying that 68%. If you want to add more runway capacity in the South East, and that is possible to do so under that growth scenario, you're going to have to limit it elsewhere.
Thank you very much indeed for your contribution this morning. Tim Johnson.